So, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour. My name is Bruno Duperron. I'm the current president of CARFEMS, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you to the 13th annual CARFEMS conference. We are extremely grateful to all the people who made this happen. So a big thank you to the conference committee, the secretariat, especially Michelle Millard and Stephanie Brown, who have worked tirelessly on preparations for this event. Also, thanks to the volunteers who are certainly one of the pillars of this conference. And also thank you to the Johnson Sherman Graduate School of Public Policy for hosting this meeting. I want to extend a particularly warm welcome to our international participants, whose numbers are growing each year, and to those of you who are attending for the first time. For those of you who are new to CARFEMS, please take a moment to learn more about us. CARFEMS is a group of passionate and engaged scholars and practitioners who share a deep commitment to the study of issues of forced migration and its impact. Our webpage includes our blog and working paper series, as well as ongoing news about the organization. Several executives are also here, so please do not hesitate to speak with us or with other members of the organization about our activities. We will have elections to renew some executive positions tomorrow. Our general meeting is on Thursday, October 28th at 11:30 CST. So for those of you who would like to become more informed or involved with the organization, please don't hesitate to join us at this general meeting. We have an exciting and thought-provoking program this year. The theme of our conference this year is Utopias as Practices. And with this theme, the CARFEMS Conference Committee wished to invite you to explore utopias and new visions of the future. Scholars, practitioners, and experts with lived experience come together to reflect on the transformative potential of utopic thinking and practices in forced migration studies. And during the next 3 days, we'll have innovative panels, workshop sessions, presentations, and special sessions on 5 sub-themes that interrogate the concept of utopias as practices. So first, how do we define, critically assess, and champion utopias at various scales? Secondly, what relationships do we see between scholarly thought and progressive actions on the ground? Third, how do actors and scholars translate the notion of utopian communities into practices? Fourth, how does indigenous and decolonial praxis inspire, adjust, correct, or impact refugee scholarship? And lastly, how do local actions generate migrant-friendly laws and policies? I would like to thank our keynote speakers, Barbara Berkins and Clement Mulalap, who will be speaking in a few minutes. I would like just to let you know that Clement is sorry he was not able to be with us live today. He's been caught in Glasgow at COP26 and has a very, very busy schedule, but fortunately he's been able to send us a short presentation that we'll broadcast in a few minutes. So this keynote will explore the potential impacts of sea level rise on Pacific Island states, in particular the conceptions of identity and community, and consider how the international community can best stand in solidarity with populations in low-lying island states. First one tomorrow morning with Bina de Costa, Sherry Aiken, and Ricard Zapata Barrero will offer 3 perspectives of utopian thinking with a focus on refugee children, on questioning immigration detention practices in the Kenyan context, and on utopian political theory applied to the issues of border. The second plenary on Friday morning will gather senior justices from around the world, from the International Association of Refugee and Migration Judges, and they will present their perspectives on refugee and migration law. The closing plenary on Friday afternoon will include a short video recorded presentation by Catherine Dauvergne, and she wished to be here with us, but her busy schedule decided otherwise. However, she kindly found some time to contribute to this conference remotely. And after her presentations, two CARFEMS members will discuss live Catherine's ideas. And so last but not least, we'll have 2 early morning sessions on Thursday. The first one will be a roundtable on refugee sponsorship as practice, politics, refusal, and the other one on refugee protection and the coming futures. We'll have later today a special session on how to debunk myths about refugees in Canada. We'll have one networking event for students and emerging scholars on Friday, and also a media exhibit on photo voice projects from Central American youth in Canada. These sessions, please use the hashtag CarFems21. Don't hesitate to do that. And to everyone, please enjoy this rich and stimulating online CarFems21 meeting. Thank you very much. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce one of our keynote speakers, sea level rise and migration in the Pacific region, considering identity, community, and solidarity. And first, I would like to introduce Dr. Barbara Berkins, who is an associate research scholar and director of the project on self-determination, environment, and migration at the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination, and lecturer in public and international affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. She received a PhD in politics from Princeton University and holds MA and MSc degrees in psychology and social and political theory, both from the University of Edinburgh. Prior to returning to Princeton, she was a predoctoral fellow with the Political Theory Project at Brown University, a Justitia Amplificata and Castle Foundation postdoctoral fellow at Goethe University, Frankfurt, and a fellow with the Center on Global Justice. And work has appeared in Critical Review of International Social and Political Philosophy, Migration Studies, Ethics, and International Affairs and Global Justice, Theory, Practice, Rhetoric. She's co-editor of Domination and Global Political Justice, Conceptual, Historical, and Institutional Perspective, which was published with Routledge in 2015. So thank you very much, Barbara, for being with us today. And I will say now a few words about Clement. Clement Mulalap, who is hailing from the island of Wahab in the Federated States of Micronesia, is an international law consultant who specializes in international environmental law, particularly climate change law and biodiversity conservation law, the law of the sea, and international indigenous law, with several articles and chapters published on those matters. And among other responsibilities, he's currently the legal advisor for the permanent mission of the Federated States of Micronesia to the United Nations, and has represented the federal states of Micronesia in various multilateral fora, including meetings for the UNFCCC and the CBD, the development of the mining code for the ISA, and negotiations for the BBNJ instrument, small island developing states, in the facilitative working group of the UNFCCC, local communities, and Indigenous Peoples platform. So thank you very much for both of us. You, Barbara, for being here today, and also thanks to Clement, who has sent us a few slides with an audio file. And Barbara, if you want to say a few words before I start Clement.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation to speak here. Both Clement and I are really honored to be able to speak here, especially on this topic, which is of great importance to us. Clement is very sorry that he cannot make it. Ironically, it's one of my slides, as you will see in a little bit, about sort of the difficulty of Pacific Island states to send large delegations to meetings. And so this morning, unfortunately, he was caught up. He was already in Glasgow. Several other people in his delegation were not able to make it, and so he has to be there now and step in. But we both have been looking forward to presenting this for you, and he would be very keen to engage with you afterwards. My last slide has his email address. But you can also reach out to me or to the organizers, and we'll be happy to put you in touch with Clement. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Barbara. If any one of you in the audience have any questions for Barbara or Clement, please use the Q&A button that you have normally at the bottom of your screen. And you can type your questions here. Barbara will read them. And now I'm going to start Clement's presentation. And so you may have to increase the sound of sufficient.
My respectful greetings to all participants here today. I very much appreciate being invited to co-deliver the keynote presentation for this session, along with Dr. Buckinx. I very much apologize for not being able to join you live for this session. As you may be aware, I am currently in Glasgow as part of the delegation of the Federated States of Micronesia, my country, for the COP26 negotiations for climate change. And my work schedule is very challenging. But there is some congruence between the work that I'm doing now and the topic of today's keynote presentation. Indeed, despite recent news about some new pledges to ramp up mitigation ambition for climate change, particularly by the major economies of the world, it is still very clear that the international community is far from getting on track to meet the 2 degrees Celsius target in the Paris Agreement, let alone the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that small island developing states, or SIDS, like my own, have long advocated. The implications of this are legion, spanning all facets of human life, and indeed all life on this world. And so in that context, for this joint keynote presentation, Dr. Buckinx and I will discuss climate change-related sea level rise, the resulting migration of Pacific Islanders, the implications for Pacific identity and community, and the importance of global solidarity in addressing such matters. I will focus for the most part on the aspects of Pacific identity and community, starting off by giving a brief overview of scientific projections of climate, discussing how international law is essentially a double-edged sword. On the one hand, helping to locate Pacific identity and community, particularly through the law of statehood and international human rights law, but on the other hand, suffering from certain deficiencies that actually make Pacific states and Pacific entities very vulnerable to slight changes in the relevant law that end up undermining such Pacific community and identity, including in the context of migration triggered by climate change-related sea level rise. And then Dr. Buckinx will follow with a number of reflections on, among other things, global solidarity in response to these challenges to Pacific identity and community. To begin, I wish to draw your attention to what my part of the world calls the Blue Pacific continent. There should be a slide on your screens, and on the slide you should see identified for you 24 Pacific countries and territories, including the so-called Pacific Small Island Developing States, or Pacific SIDS, Australia, New Zealand, and the number of overseas territories of several European countries. This continent is made up of over 40 million people who are spread over 42 million square kilometers. Significantly, our countries and territories control nearly a third of the world's exclusive economic zones. These countries and territories typically coordinate as part of the Pacific Islands Forum, which regularly uses the moniker of Blue Pacific Continent to underscore our massive size, as well as the importance of the ocean to who we are as a people. Recent scientific assessments, including the IPCC's special reports on 1.5 degrees Celsius, as well as on the ocean and cryosphere and the change in climate, project that sea level rise could reach up to a meter by the end of this century, with many SIDS experiencing what are currently centennial coastal inundation events pretty much annually by the middle of this century, with coastal damage increasing by up to 3 orders of magnitude for such SIDS by the end of this century. Also, sea level rise is occurring at a greater rate in parts of the Pacific compared to other parts of the world, including the Western Pacific, where I am from, with many islands in the Pacific no more than a few meters above sea level, including entire states such as Nauru, the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and Tuvalu. It is clear that sea level rise is a particular menace, unlike any other for the Pacific. In this context of sea level rise, there are challenges for Pacific Islanders from a legal perspective. These are challenges not just from an economic and political and legal aspect, but also identity and community, both of which have long been forged and molded by close connections the Pacific Islanders have with their natural environment. And so for my part of this joint presentation, I will focus on 2 major types of legal challenges. Number 1, challenges to statehood, and number 2, challenges to the enjoyment of core human rights, including the right of peoples to self-determination. I will first identify how the relevant international law is capacious enough to allow certain rights and entitlements for Pacific Islands under each type of international law, but then also discuss how each type of international law is hamstrung by certain inherent elements of each type that struggle to cope with the threats of climate change-related sea level rise, including in connection with migration. In terms of statehood, a particularly influential view under international law specifies that an entity is considered to be a state under international law if it possesses a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. For small islands with small populations like those in the Pacific, this theory of international law is a major boon for us, because these 4 criteria are relatively expansive enough to be readily met, at least at an initial phase, by such Pacific entities. Each Pacific island at the moment has a permanent population, however small, a defined territory, however small, a government, however challenged in terms of capacity and economics, and the capacity to engage in foreign affairs unless otherwise granted to a foreign power. In this manner, Pacific Island communities have taken on the moniker of being Pacific SIDS, where they are a united bloc with notable influence in various decisions, elections, and related matters. Even though Pacific SIDS are spread over a wide expanse of the ocean, the Pacific SIDS have formed an identity as a group of islands with major political and legal pull while working in a unified manner as a Pacific community, at least in these multilateral fora. We lean heavily on our identities as states under international law to allow us to expand and project our influence beyond our shores. But on the other hand, while these 4 criteria realities in Pacific Islands, the question remains whether sea level rise might undermine these criteria on multiple levels to the detriment of Pacific Islands. If sea level rise inundates part or all of a Pacific Island's territory, is that not a challenge to the criterion of defined territory? What if sea level rise forces Pacific Islanders from their ancestral homes in search of refuge elsewhere, a permanent population? If sea level rise disrupts socioeconomic conditions in a Pacific island to the point that its governing entities are unable to properly provide for their people and end up losing the trust of their people, will that not in turn undermine the criterion of a government being in existence as well as affairs? Indeed, in my view, these 4 criterion of statehood seem designed to favor those entities that have the capacity and wherewithal, as well as the sheer social and political sizes and power, to be able to prop themselves up and perpetuate all of their affairs to avoid. The gift of statehood, in other words, turns out to be a potentially fleeting one, at least for Pacific SIDS. A second set of legal challenges has to do with human rights, or international human rights. Recently, as you may be aware, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution that recognizes, for the first time by a UN body, that there exists a right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The Human Rights Council also decided to establish a mandate for a new special rapporteur on the relationship between climate change and human rights. Both measures were the result of sustained advocacy by Pacific SIDS, among others, who have long recognized the clear linkages between anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions on the one hand and the enjoyment of human rights on the other hand. Indeed, in our view, human rights law is expansive enough to encompass not just the so-called civil and political rights long championed by many Western states, but also so-called economic, social, and cultural rights that are heavily favored by developing countries that continue to privilege close connections to the environment as well as their rich cultural roots. Through this latter set of rights, there is a global recognition for the right to enjoy cultural practices, engage in sacred traditions, and develop social structures in ways that hold the most meaning for their respective societies. Pacific identities as culturally rich, traditionally structured, and heritage-minded societies find much favor in this second set of international human rights law. However, sea level rise challenges potentially such a situation. If your identity and communal nature are connected to certain cultural and traditional practices that are in turn connected and rooted in the presence of certain coastal conditions, the continuation of island lifestyles, and the presence of peoples living in close communion on isolated islands across the ocean, then it stands to reason that something like sea level rise could threaten such identity and communal nature, including by inundating important sites for sacred practices, as well as forcing the breakup of close-knit island communities into diasporas. We see this already happening in my own country of the FSM, regularly migrate to larger developed country allies such as the United States and New Zealand due to challenging socioeconomic and environmental conditions at home. Do such islanders retain their rights to various traditional and cultural practices, and indeed to their identities and communal interests as Pacific Islanders? A key human right that must not be ignored in this discussion is that of the right of peoples to self-determination. In my view, and as reflected in a number of UN General Assembly resolutions, as well as various international tribunals, this right is not limited to the right to achieve political independence from colonial overlords, but also includes the right of peoples to freely dispose of their natural resources. This is an economic right that is arguably deeply threatened by sea level rise, which could impact coastal conditions that are conducive to tourism in island economies, for example, as well as potentially shift states' maritime zones landward and reduce the rights and entitlements that such states would otherwise enjoy under the law of the sea, at least according to some scholars. This again is another example of the sort of dual-edged nature of international law afflicting Pacific SIDS. On the one hand, the law of the sea grants significant rights and entitlements to small islands because of how massive their exclusive economic zones are relative to their small sizes. But on the other hand, there's an argument being made that such rights and entitlements are subject to the shifting caused by sea level rise, even though the peoples of these sea level rise. It is clear that international law can be a capricious force with long-standing implications for the identity and communal interests of Pacific Islanders. To conclude, I leave you with a question in light of my presentation. What are some solutions to this conundrum of caprice, which is how I call it? particularly solutions by the international community in the interest of solidarity. This is, I guess, my cue for my fellow co-presenter, Dr. Buckinx, and her part of our joint presentation to begin. I hope I've provided some useful food for thought for you. I do apologize once again for not being able to join you live today, but I've informed the organizers that I'm very happy to receive questions and requests and comments by email directly, and the organizers will share my email discussion as well as other related matters. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Perfect. So now back to you, Barbara.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Okay. Thank you very much again for inviting us. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you here. And I just hope that I can do, in the Q&A, I hope I can do both of us, Clement, but as I said, I'm very happy to connect you with him if the questions you have are for him, since he is a legal scholar and I am not, so our expertise areas don't fully overlap. In any case, with no further ado, let me continue and hopefully where Clement left off. So I want to say a little bit by way of context. So Clement, of course, is deeply steeped both by birth, but also by profession in specifically the problems related to sea level rise in the Pacific. My own way of getting there is a little bit more circumspect. So I have a political theory PhD by training, but I organized an off-the-record series last year on self-determination and sea level rise to complement what was going on, or what still is going on, at the ILC, the International Law Commission, which now has a working group on sea level rise in relation to international law. And it seemed to me that it was interesting and important to see what we can do to complement that program and get people in the room who in a UN context may not be able to speak freely, but might be willing to do so in a closed session. So we had a series of meetings with immediately affected peers and with some members of civil society. And we discussed, in essence, what is the program of the ILC working group, namely statehood and sovereignty, citizenship and statelessness, although they refer to protection of persons. We talked about adaptation as well, and UN responses. The ILC also talks about maritime zones separately, and we folded that in with our discussion on statehood and sovereignty. And we wrote a report trying to highlight what we believed are the most important takeaways, which include sort of considering conceptions of identity and community more seriously. So in my presentation, I want to say a little bit about migration as adaptation and its the enthusiasm or lack thereof of Pacific Islanders for that strategy. I want to say a little bit about some aspects of the literature on migration and the literature on territory. And then I want to talk about strategies for moving forward with a couple of different focal points. First, to start with migration as adaptation, it's very clear from our meetings with representatives of states and with representatives of civil society from the region that migration as adaptation is, a second best solution. Now, when you go to surveys, the very first representative household survey was 6 years ago at this point. You do see that people indicate that they're likely to leave if the environmental conditions continue to deteriorate. 70% of respondents from Kiribati and Tuvalu, 35% of respondents from Nauru. But the key to that, and there's a lot of research on this, including by Jay McAdam, is that individuals wish to retain home. And home, as Clement, I think, has started to explain, is very expansive and very connected to the land and to communal identity that is not easily replaced when moved elsewhere. Now, of course, it's difficult to convey this perspective on the international stage. This is the slide I was referring to that I put together before Clement had to pull out, but it's ironic because it reflects this particular problem. The headline here is from The Guardian, which said that, you know, a third of Pacific Islands are unable to attend COP26. The context there is COVID and quarantines rather than the size of delegations, but generally there's an asymmetry at the international level, whereby, yes, it is great that these states, it's been a boon, as Clement says, that these states are states and are you know, equal at the international level in any UN or state-based organization. However, they don't come with the same resources, economic wealth, and so regional or global powers. Many countries of origins are neither of those and have very little bargaining power when it comes to pushing for a system that prioritizes, let's say, the movement of human populations if and when, for economic or other reasons, they so desire. And that is just difficult to do at the international level. There's also another set of asymmetries, and that is between generations, which is particularly relevant when it comes to climate-related migration. So, you know, we heard Clement talk about the connection between the people, and the land and the environment. You know, whatever generation first moves, first generation migrants, let's say, will retain a connection by having lived there, of, you know, what it is like to be in the Pacific, what it is like to be right there with the land and with the sea. Future generations won't have that perspective, and that's where I think that the real problems come in terms of continuity of communal identity, when that identity is so closely related to something that is no longer experienced by individual cohort. And I noted here, so Nicholas Stern came out with an update on his paper. He presented, you know, one of the first reports in 2006 on climate change related or impacts thereof. And his new paper says, well, if anything, he underestimated how badly things were going to be in 2006. And he also highlighted that, you know, economists, and in his view, he's an economist himself, do future generations a great disservice by the way that they discount for the future. And there's a variety of ways that models do that. There's some inherent discounting. There's an assumption that the present matters more than the future. There's also an assumption that the uncertainty of the future means you have to discount in the model. And the third type is discounting because of an anticipation that there will be technological change that will be able to prevent some of the worst impacts from materializing. Now, all of that is particularly problematic when it comes to generations of Pacific Islanders who may not be able to experience their ancestral homelands. Now, let me go on to talking a little bit about the migration literature. As you know, I'm sure, so in light of, you know, this conception of the Blue Pacific, as I'm sure you know, there's a presumption in some of the literature of methodological nationalism. To some extent, that just reflects what actually is the case legally and politically of categories of citizens versus migrants. However, it doesn't fit neatly, you know, as we all know, historical patterns of human mobility in general, but also in the Pacific. So Pacific Islanders, as far as I understand this, as a relative outsider, right, to the field, have a sense of mobility across the ocean from an island to another that doesn't necessarily neatly map onto borders in the traditional sense. And this is, I think, where the Blue Pacific comes in. The methodological nationalism at the heart of some of the migration literature leads to a relative neglect of forms of migration where international borders aren't crossed at all, right? Internal migration, or where they're crossed repeatedly or in patterns that aren't sort of unidirectional. So circular migration, which of course now has received a lot of attention, or repeat migration, return migration, and then internal migration. Whereas we know this sharp distinction between the internal migrant and the external migrant doesn't really match the experience of the migrants themselves or the communities that host them. So I think the concern potentially is that this distinction diverts our attention from the ways in which climate-related migration in the Pacific region may play out. It is useful to individuals in the region to be able to migrate, so to have the right to, as for instance, in Clement's case from the Federated States of Micronesia, to be able to move to the United States without a visa, to be able to return right to FSM at any point in time. You know, the ways in which people in the region already migrate are not necessarily clear when we think about citizen versus migrant. So the fluidity also obscures the ways in which they are nevertheless very closely connected or feel connected to their ancestral homelands. And then finally, I want to highlight researcher Lilo Mayava, doctor at the University of Hawaii, who works on migration in Pacific Islands, you know, has written that actually she thinks migration might be entirely the wrong term in the region, right? Because it implies a severance of ties and rupture, where instead she thinks transnationalism is the way to think about movement of peoples across the region or out. And then, you know, theoretically, there's been sort of a reliance on occupancy rights, and of course, occupancy by people, given that we're not amphibian, you know, means occupancy of land rather than living, you know, in the ocean or with the ocean. I think some counterpoints to that are, you know, there's good work by, let's say, Chris Armstrong on the ocean as a common pool resource. But I don't think it maps onto the concept of the Blue Pacific, as I understand it, right, or large ocean states, because it is not it's not a common resource for the world, that is, in the way that I think you know, Western philosophy understands that. But instead, it is something that is sort of part of the community. It might be shared with others, right? It might be regionally shared. However, there are distinctive location-based, right, so specific concepts of what the ocean means to specific parts of the Pacific that are not captured if we just think about the ocean as a common pool resource. What I do think the literature on territory has done and has helped, I think, with the cause of you know, Pacific Islanders grappling with having to potentially move, is that I think the literature now agrees that place has moral significance to such an extent, right, that migration itself will just never be sufficient to compensate for loss of territory. That territory is not interchangeable with other territory, and that even the strategies that are being pursued by certain nation states in the region, you know, putting together funds in order to be able to potentially lease land, actually purchasing land, right, and moving, that will not be sufficient in order to compensate for what the loss of territory means. It may nevertheless need to be done, but I think understanding the moral significance of place will help us as academics keep that front and center, that there actually is no way to compensate adequately for that. Now let me think about some ways of moving forward, so strategies. I don't want to presume that I know what the objectives are of the peoples and individuals in question. What came through in our off the record series and you know, from the literature as well, is that there's obviously a diversity of opinions. Migration is not sought after as a strategy. However, it is nevertheless being pursued by individuals or potentially also by states themselves. But that being said, so the possible objectives, I think, are in two categories. It's either to prevent climate-related migration entirely, right? And then you can do that in two ways, at least. You know, you can halt or even reverse climate change. And scientists have talked about, you know, the extent to which the latter is possible. and you can achieve adaptation, which again, you can talk to scientists about the ways in which that can be done. And very often what you run into are cost effectiveness arguments, which throw up their own moral concerns, because it is being done for large coastal cities, right? But the cost effectiveness of it changes when you think about low density population islands. So anyways, that's the first category, is to prevent migration. And the second is to provide pathways for migration that somehow try to take into account these conceptions of identity of community. One strategy that has been pursued is to tie climate migration to other international topics, in particular national security, with a view to pooling some, attracting attention, giving it some more weight, pooling resources, if you will. Ingrid Boas wrote a good book about this a while ago, and her conclusion is essentially that it's not a successful strategy. Nevertheless, a strategy still exists. So this headline is from the Groundswell report, an update of the Groundswell report by the World Bank, that says that climate change could force, however, 1 million people to migrate internally by 2050. And the security strategy, which was, in her book, particularly in that time frame, was being pursued by United Kingdom and some European countries, together with a number of small island states, was to say, well, there's going to be mass movement leading to tension and conflict, including violent conflict. And it was used as a strategy to obtain concessions on climate targets, including limiting greenhouse gas emissions. And one particular target that she looks at was India. Now, she concludes it's not a successful strategy. I think in light of what the report, the meetings in the report showed me, as well as in light of what Clement said, I think it has another deficiency as well, which is that it forces affected populations to adopt a language that is in fact not central to their concerns. So strategically, it might be the correct thing to do. Ingrid Boas again thinks that it's not. But even if it is, it's a concession that might be a moral concession too far, right? So it might cede some of the moral ground, and it might cede some of the vocabulary and the narrative that is necessary in order to keep everyone focused on what is actually being lost if and when these populations need to migrate away from their homelands. Strategies that I think are potentially more promising. So one is, and this is being pursued obviously by Pacific Island states as well as individuals and allies, is to just look through various international institutions and bodies of law for the parts of it that are either already amenable to making arguments about, let's say, the Blue Pacific and what it means to be a Pacific Island state, what it means to have citizenship in such a state, or to find parts that can be modified, that are malleable, or that can be interpreted anew to make room for these concerns. So there's climate change and sustainability, of course, and COP26 is where Clement is right now. There are sustainable development goals, especially those related to the ocean, but not exclusively related to the ocean. Then you have the International Law Commission and International Law Association. As I mentioned, our working group was started as a way to complement what was going on at ILC. But ILA has also been working on this, and they're focusing on what sovereignty means if and when there are any changes related to sea level rise, and what can be done with regard to the protection of persons. Another rubric or another area where there is potential is in migration and citizenship. There's obviously too much to mention here. I think many of you will be aware of this. But the Global Compact, for instance, does mention climate-related migration. And then, a couple of years ago, there was an interesting project at the UNDP in their Project Catalyst, and they called the initiative Migrant Union, and it was an effort to decouple citizenship rights from territory. Now, their impetus was not climate-related migration per se, but it was refugees in general. Territory where you yourself are not located on the territory. And then finally, of course, there's refugee law and humanitarian law. and too much to mention, truly. But there is, as you know, there's an effort to try to understand whether there can be such a category as a climate refugee, either to locate it in the law or to use it politically to pressure particular states, to shame them really into creating that category legally in order to do something either for individuals or for people's sort of as a whole-scale relocation, forced relocation as a result of climate-related sea level rise or climate change more broadly. My sense of this is that most importantly, it's to use all of this flexibly. So, we all are professionals with a particular set of expertise or the types of rubrics here that we're interested in will vary. And I know very little, for instance, about the science of climate change. I think what Pacific Island states and civil society organizations and individuals are doing are looking broadly and trying to see what can help them. And so I think it behooves us as academics to be a bit open-minded about that. And so not to push a particular project because it seems academically or intellectually the most accurate or appropriate for us, but rather to see, to what extent it can help Pacific Island communities and individuals as they see it. Because I think that they are picking and choosing because of the urgency of the matter and the importance of the matter. And so if we can help, with our expertise, I think that is to be applauded, right? If somehow what we are doing doesn't seem to resonate, as for instance, the discussion of statelessness in the meetings, it's a bit peripheral, but we talked about statelessness, and it's clear that absolutely no one is interested in talking about statelessness other than lawyers, right, who work on statelessness. The Pacific Island communities themselves are not. Is to then say with some humility, well, I'm interested still academically, but it is not something that seems to resonate. And then finally, coalition building. So there's also obviously a whole lot going on there, with other states within the Pacific. And I think Clement talked about Pacific Islands Forum. There's also the Pacific Community. There's also some attempts to do some coalition building with other states that are similarly located. I mean, that are not necessarily at risk in the same way, but Caribbean states, for instance, in CARICOM, the Caribbean Community. And then some potential for coalition building with other locations vulnerable to climate migration. I've put here the cities that are, according to some report, the most at risk there. Of course, there might be some meeting of the minds there in terms of trying to prevent the effects of climate-related sea level rise. But when it comes to the resources to deal with them in terms of adaptation, there is really no comparison whatsoever. The resources are not there for the Pacific communities and states. And then finally, Indigenous peoples. So UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was not at all enthusiastically received by Pacific Island states, 10 of whom just did not even show up. Now, Hervé Raimana-Lallemand just published an interesting paper on this. He is he's a Polynesian, French Polynesian scholar. He thought that he thinks that the problem is, so obviously they did not define what an Indigenous people is in the declaration. But they made several gestures to how they understood it, and he thinks it was too narrow. So it has a temporal element, the Indigenous people prior to colonization. There is the ethnic element, sort of the people having a distinct culture. And then there's a power differential element, as in the power of the Indigenous people versus the power of the majority. And he says it's a third that doesn't map onto the realities of the Pacific Island states, because most of those states are in fact majorities demographically as well as majorities in the institutions. But anyway, that means that there's also potential for a meeting of the minds, and I do think that that there's a recognition on both sides that there is a whole lot of overlap in terms of the ways that place matters to identity and to community. And then finally, a couple notes on how people in civil society and academia can be allies. I think obviously there's ways to amplify the voices of Pacific Islanders. And I think that there's also ways to, if they are not in the room, if we find ourselves in a room, their matters are discussed that are important to them, to be, proxy representative, surrogate, to provide surrogate accountability. And as you know, there's some literature on that, on how that can be done. It is second best, but it's better than no accountability at all or no representation at all. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very, very much for the invitation to speak. I really appreciate it. That's my email address and Clement's email address. Please, feel free to contact me. Obviously, we'll have the Q&A now, but feel free to contact me if you want to talk to Clement about something in his presentation, or just if you have any questions for him. Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Barbara. Thank you also to Clement. And if CARFEMS members in the audience have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A button here. Thank you.
Sorry, it took me a while to see this. Oh, it just showed up. Wonderful. So the question is, some people have been working on creating a climate refugee category in Canadian immigration law. What do you think should be considered in designing this kind of category? It's a great question. So I think, so I'll say the first thing, but that's probably the easiest way of answering it first. I get the feeling it's not quite what is needed, because it focuses on individuals rather than on peoples, and on creating things around people, right? So, or creating things around individuals. So if you relocate individuals as forced refugees or forced migrants or refugees, you do not take with you anything in terms of the connection to place. You have your memories, you have diaspora organizations, but you don't have the equivalent of what the attempts are to lease territory, right? To lease territory and to have a whole-scale relocation. So in that sense, it's suboptimal. I think what ought to be included, I mean, it has to be capacious, because it's very clear that in terms of the science, right? So it's not going to be it's not going to be the obvious inundation, right? So it's not going to be the climate refugee, if we're thinking about a particular individual in a particular location, will probably need to move long before everyone in even that particular island will have to move, right? It will be someone who is particularly vulnerable because they are on a piece of land where salinization of the water supply, has already advanced, and so they can't cultivate the land anymore, and they have trouble getting drinking water, let's say. That will not be everyone on the island. There will be someone a little bit more fortunate who is higher up, right, who will not need to leave. So it would have to be capacious to not focus on the sort of the catastrophic impacts of climate change, but rather anything. I mean, in my view, it needs to include economic, reference points. So, for instance, with salinization of the water supply, and I'm speaking really on my own personal capacity. I don't know if Clement would agree at all, but it would need to be something where you also include the particular socioeconomic vulnerabilities of the person. So that the kind of thing that makes them vulnerable as a climate refugee because of connections to, the connections of events that are happening around them to climate change, would have to take into account the fact that they're already badly situated, if you will, to weather this, that they already don't have the resilience within that society to weather this type of change. So it would have to be quite capacious, and I think it would have to include recognition that it will be impossible to demonstrate, right? So it cannot be possible to demonstrate without a shadow of the doubt that the person has to move because of climate change related weather events. It would have to be something like weather events that are most likely increasing at an accelerated time frame, the way that Clement describes, right? So these events are happening or occurring at an accelerated time frame, making it more difficult for people to recover. So
So it seems that Barbara is frozen. So we're going to see if we can get back to her. Just give us a couple of minutes. Thank you for your patience.
It looks like Barbara went off Zoom, so I think she's trying to reconnect. So apologies, please bear with us.
We just sent him an email, sent her an email, so going to see if we can have a reconnections. Sorry about that.
I'm terribly sorry. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can. Yeah, thank you, Barbara.
So I mean, it's very difficult to explain. I lost internet entirely, everything. So I don't know exactly how long I've been gone, and I apologize. I also don't think I can see the chat. I'm on my phone because I know that I have internet here. So I'm going to go to my, let's see, I'm trying to see if I can connect to Wi-Fi again, because then I can be on my phone. I'm terribly sorry. I don't know what you missed. Oh, okay, it's back online. So let me try to connect via my phone, via my laptop. I'm so sorry. Sorry. So the category of the climate refugee, to go back to the first question, I don't know what you missed. I think ought to be very capacious. There's just no way to include. There's no way to. Oh, sorry. Now I'm really trying to, I'm now having a hard time trying to connect. I think it ought to include an understanding of resilience and vulnerability that is quite individual and quite capacious, because it will be impossible to demonstrate a causal connection of particular events that led a person to want to migrate to climate change. I mean, anthropomorphic, whatever, climate change, rather than, you know, there being a hurricane, because it would be very easy for any type of government that is reluctant to admit refugees to say that really this is a hurricane, right? And so, and plenty of places in the world have hurricanes. You know, the Pacific is not the only region that is suffering from hurricanes. Yes, they are occurring more frequently and are more severe in their effects, but look, plenty of other people on your exact same island are still there? And the answer will be, of course, they're still there because they happen to be in a different socioeconomic class, or they just happen to be fortunate enough that their house is located a little bit higher above ground. So I think that's an answer to the first question. I think it ought to be quite capacious, and ideally it would be a joint effort to create that category, but also to think about what it would mean to relocate entire populations, and not to Canada, but rather to expand effort to try to have them relocate to islands in the region. And so I think that this is where a lot of funding is needed. And it's a pity that Clement is not here to be able to speak to that, but and I don't know if he would be willing to speak to it also, because he is a diplomat after all, but so I can say it, I guess, freely, with a caveat that I might be wrong, but huge economic resources are needed. And they'd be best spent, I think, in trying to help, to trying to gauge what the desires and wishes are of the relevant populations, and then to help them relocate in the area, so that they are closer, in just the character of the place where they're located is closer to the character that they have been forced to, where they have been forced to leave, but also that they can relocate as groups and families and communities, rather than piecemeal when, under the conditions of forced migration, which are also always very suboptimal, happen at the last possible moment. You don't take anything with you, as you're all well aware. Thank you. I'm trying to still connect. So if someone could read the other questions to me, I'm so sorry, I don't seem to see the chat.
Yeah, sure, Barbara. I can read the second question to you.
Thank you.
So do you see any lessons in this struggle for thinking through utopic visions for the futures for all displaced people?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think I wish that they weren't providing us with this opportunity, but I think there's an opportunity to rethink what it means for us to be citizens as well. I don't know if that's quite what the question, the person was asking, but I think that's the opportunity, is that I think what we're trying to, what we can do is think about what it means for us to be connected to place, which is valuable for us, even if we are not, in fact, ourselves at risk of being relocated or forcibly relocated. And we can think about ways to revision what the category of citizen ought to mean, right? And so there, maybe we want to, as this project at Project Catalyst at UNDP tried to do, there could be various of these types of projects, as far as I'm concerned, where you think about ways to decouple citizenship rights, or the enjoyment of citizenship rights, from a territory. And many of us are located not in our place of birth. Many students, international students, it's not at all like forced relocation or forced migration, refugeedom, of course. However, even those individuals, you're suddenly, by leaving voluntarily as a tourist or as a student, you suddenly have only a subset of your rights available to you. And I think that doesn't work very well with the actual patterns of human mobility. And we also might want to think about whether we ought to try to encourage mobility, or at least not make it so difficult that people do it anyway, but they do it knowing that they're relinquishing some of their rights or the enjoyment of those rights. So I think that's the advantage that this is providing us, is to think through what it means to hold citizenship rights connected to place, connected to community. And the other thing I think that the Blue Pacific as a concept does is, I think it's really helpful to think about belonging as being about more than land. I think this is, so I wasn't able to say this in the presentation, but during the off-the-record meetings, it occurred, several of the representatives said, well, there's several islands in our state, and unfortunately I don't know the state in question off the top of my head, that have been submerged for decades, right, and may or may not be related to sea level change. It might just be natural change, not related to anthropomorphic climate change, but parts that have been submerged. However, these submerged parts are still part and parcel of how we understand our community. And I think that is very helpful. So that might help us understand, it's difficult for us to move at the speed that climate change is forcing us to move in terms of thinking about territorial changes and how to understand territory. But of course, at some point, 8,000, 10,000 years ago or something, right, there was a connection between Great Britain and the continent, right? So it was possible to walk across during the last ice age. And so the time frame is not conducive to the way that human beings think. This is too quick for us, right, as a transition. But thinking of the Blue Pacific, I think maybe might open up some avenues for rethinking what it means to belong to places, so places that are no longer there, or peoples that are no longer there may nevertheless be part and parcel of the way we understand ourselves. And so these, as I said, these submerged islands are kept alive entirely by the communities in their telling of what it means to be part of the community and so forth. I hope that answered the question.
Great, thank you very much, Barbara. We have here a third question, and if attendees want to send other questions, please do so. We have ample time for the Q&A session. So this question, and I'm going to read it to you, Barbara. Current protection regime does not consider climate refugee, and there are debates whether they are deserving or not for resettlement.
Recording.
You have some feedback.
No, I'm back to Wi-Fi. I'm so sorry.
Okay, good.
We finally have internet again, but sorry, apologies.
No problem. Do you want me to restart?
Yes, thank you, sorry.
Sure. Current protection regime does not consider climate refugee, and there are debates whether they are deserving or not for resettlement. Should there be a different legal international obligation be in place? And is there anything at the UN level going on that complements to this line of thinking?
I can't answer the second question very well. I don't know if there's anything happening. I think that it's not a very good fit. And maybe my first question, hopefully the way I answered it was somewhat clear. So I don't think it's I don't think climate refugee is the best fit for the actual, for the person who needs to relocate. In terms of being deserving for resettlement, I think they're absolutely deserving of resettlement, right? So I think the obligation is very clear, not in the way that it is in the refugee, in the convention, right? The refugee regime, it's not a humanitarian obligation exclusively. It's in fact, it's the redressing of past harms, right? So it's very clear that the countries where we tend to live, not everyone, of course, but if you're located in North America or in Europe, that we're responsible for climate change and the impact that it's now having in the Pacific. Pacific Islanders themselves are very minimally responsible. If you go back several generations, let's say, you don't want to go back too long, then it's a difficult philosophical argument about who is responsible and why for what ancestors have done. But it's very clear that that in the countries where most of us live, we are responsible for what is happening. So I don't think the humanitarian category is sufficient, right? I don't think that doesn't even really touch the surface of what's going on. So I think that there's a grave historical wrong that we could try to right. By opening up the category of the climate refugee. If there is no better way of doing so, I think strategically I'm fine with sort of people trying whatever they can in order to make sure that there's ways for these individuals to live full lives. And if the best way for them to do so is via the category of climate refugee, I think that's good. I think they're absolutely deserving of resettlement. And in fact, I think they could make good claims for being resettled in particular locations because of the harms that were done by particular countries. So I think it's not, that's the type of international obligation that is operative. But as I said, I think that it's not a humanitarian obligation, or it's not the humanitarian obligation at the level of the individual. It's sort of a historical wrong that is best addressed. It's good to have it probably as a second best at the level of the individual, but I think ideally these individuals are approached, they're consulted, they're listened to seriously, and then there's sort of a sense of collaborative, I don't know, effort to try to get them what they think they need and what they can, justify. So if that's relocation to a nearby island, but they'll need obviously a whole lot of money to make that happen, because you don't just relocate the people, you have to try to relocate, right, graveyards and whatever places of importance exist. Then that ought to happen. I think that's the type of obligation that we're dealing with. And I think, the IPCC and other documents have started to become a little bit more forceful about the types of harms that were done and the types of impacts it's having now on people in the Pacific. But in terms of whether anything is going on at the UN level, I don't know enough about, the ILC is the commission, right? It was pushed by, among others, Pacific Island states to open a working plan, right? A working group to discuss the effects of sea level rise. And then because it's the International Law Commission, it's just on sea level rise impacts on international law. So there's a real emphasis on statehood. And that is a concern for the states themselves, obviously, because as Clement says, and it's absolutely true, statehood has been very beneficial for the well-being of the peoples who reside there. However, it's not really the end-all and be-all end-all for those individuals. What they also need is a sense of continuity in the community and in their sense of identity. And that's not something that's being discussed in the ILC. There's really there's no vocabulary for it. There's this is not part of the discussion. Now, when we had our off-the-record meetings, 2 co-chairs of the ILC working group attended our sessions and seemed very open to soliciting feedback from states, but also from non-state actors on various of these matters, on what the priorities are, on what the people in question would like to see. Are they particularly concerned about maritime zones? Are they particularly concerned about statelessness? Right, and so there was some sense that they were interested in soliciting feedback. But the UN is always going to be a state-based organization, and in that sense is whatever room there can be made to solicit civil society feedback is always going to be around the edges rather than as sort of a central part of the organization's aims and purpose. If that answers your question there, but thank you, Aziz. I see. Great, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Barbara. Are there other questions? If not, I'm going to ask one. I have, Barbara. So in one of the last slides, you mentioned the coalition building with international coalitions, with other island states, with other locations that are vulnerable to climate change. And you also mentioned other actors, indigenous people, allies, for instance, scholars. And so you have on one hand, international coalitions. And I want to ask you how transnational coalitions, what role they may have in this work of coalition building.
Do you mean specifically the transnational coalitions with, let's say, CARICOM or other nation states or cities or something of that sort? Sorry, I don't know exactly which part.
Yeah, so transnational coalitions with, for instance, you mentioned indigenous people. So if there are transnational networks that support, for instance. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I think that the thinking behind coalitions is really that it enhances the power of the Pacific Island states and peoples. And communities. And so I think this is what is also behind the push by, at that time, at least the UK and some other European states and some small island states to link, I mean, it's still happening, but at least, then to link climate change to security concerns. And there's been some, linking that to, I don't know, I mean, security concerns is very broad. It could be terrorism too. Areas where that the international community will pay attention, will look up, pay attention, and will spend money. But I think the literature on sort of coalitions of the weak is really what I was thinking about. In that this is where there's only so much you can do to direct someone's attention to a topic that you want to think about deeply, when the population that is affected is very small. I mean, I think Clement will be the first to. He said it also in his presentation. These are very small. I mean, the size of the population is minuscule. The size of the country is gigantic, especially if you have the maritime zones, but the countries are small. You know, the way to increase your power if you're weak is to enlarge, right, the coalition with others. And then if you have a coalition of that sort, you might actually be able to put something on the agenda that you otherwise weren't able to, or, you know, demand certain concessions that you otherwise weren't able to. So that's really the idea, is that the coalition with indigenous peoples, I think, goes beyond that, and it's not just coalitions of the weak as sort of a numbers game. But I think there's a real, I think some of the push to reconceptualize what self-determination means, you know, comes from scholars and activists and people within the indigenous communities in you know, Canada and United States. And I think that that's, you know, that might also be important, because it would, you know, it would reflect what is actually true, you know, would reflect how people in the Pacific actually think about community, which is now the international understanding of self-determination is rather reductive and state-based. And so I think that this might be one way forward, from which we would all benefit, I think, if we were able to think a little bit more expansively about what it means to have a self-determining community, or to have a sense of self and identity as related to the community, as related to place. So I think some of the coalitions are sort of the thing in mind is to temporarily, strategically increase the power of the Pacific Island communities to put their own items on the agenda, or to push for certain concessions. The coalition with the indigenous peoples, and you know, I'm hoping to organize something, but we'll see whether you know, it's always more difficult with COVID. But it should be able to get done at some point. Is to think about, you know, getting people in the room from indigenous peoples, representatives from indigenous peoples, you know, as well as the indigenous peoples of the Pacific, because as I said, they actually are majority indigenous. But to have them in the room together and to think through what community means, and whether they're, you know, to what extent the overlap is fruitful and might help us all think about self-determination as well as place and community in a more expansive way.
Great, thank you so much, Barbara. Last call for questions. I don't see. Wait a few seconds. No, apparently. So I would like to, on behalf of CARFEMS, thank very warmly Barbara and also Clement for sharing those great ideas and thoughts, answering our questions. And so if CARFEMS members have further questions for Clement, you, Barbara, shared his email in your slides. So thank you again for taking the time to be with us today. Really appreciate it. And so I would like to say to CARFEMS members that we have next a session coordinated by Aziz Rahman about debunking myths about refugees in Canada, and we have also a media exhibit on photo voice projects from Central America youth in Canada, and then we'll have parallel sessions in the afternoon. So thank you again, Barbara, thank you, Clement, and see you in the next sessions.
Thank you so much. And I apologize for the loss of electricity, which I didn't anticipate would happen. And I apologize also for Clement not being able to make it. My email is bbuckinx@princeton.edu, but you can also find me. And his is a little bit more difficult to find because he's a diplomat. So if you don't remember or didn't write it down, feel free to email me and I'll be happy to put you in touch with Clement. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much for inviting me and Clement to participate. Thank you.
Thank you again, and my apologies. My neighbor decided to be in full synchronicity for his work at home, and end this conference. So yeah, my apologies as well. Thank you very much.